I just finished this book, Everything I Want to Do is Illegal by Joel Salatin. And I thought that what this book discussed was so important that I'm going to provide a summary of it here because I know a lot of people aren't going to read it, but I really think people need to understand some of the things discussed in this book. On the face of it, it appears to just be about a farmer complaining about all the ridiculous regulations that the government has placed on him. And that might seem like a niche topic, but it's about so much more than that. So even if that subject seems very far from your life, I guarantee you that the things discussed in this book, it affects you in really big ways. And not just in obvious ways that affect, for example, the costs of your food or what kinds of foods are available on the market. But I think it'll also help you answer even bigger questions about, say, modern living. Like if you've wondered why it is that so many of the things we buy come from large corporations instead of small mom and pop shops, this book can help you understand why. Or if you want to know how the oligarchy uses the government to consolidate whole industries,
more and more moving toward an oligarchy.
This book can help you understand how. Anyway, I hope that by providing a summary of some of the most important points in this book, you'll realize that the type of things happening in farming, it's happening in many sectors of the economy. In fact, there were so many things in this book where I saw parallels with what happened during COVID, where there was this top-down control of health from bureaucrats that caused all kinds of negative unintended consequences. I'll get into all that. So in case you didn't know, the author of this book, Joel Salatin, he calls himself the lunatic farmer. He was featured a lot in Michael Pollan's book, The Omnivore's Dilemma. I read this book over a decade ago, and the parts about Salatin were pretty much the only things I remembered about the book. But until I had read about how Joel Salatin runs his farm, I had been under the impression that growing meat was not good for the planet, that it was less environmentally friendly than just being vegetarian. But the way that Salatin or other regenerative farmers grow meat, they do it in a way that's actually good for the environment. It's not just that they create manure, for example, that you can use to enrich the soil, but the grasses will be healthier by having a certain level of grazing on it, by rotating the animals across the pastures. So there's a lot of knowledge of ecology that goes into how he raises his animals. Now, one of the things you learn very quickly from reading this book is how so many perfectly reasonable things you might want to do as a farmer are just straight up illegal to do. And that's why this is called Everything I Want to Do is Illegal. For example, if you wanted to grow animals like cows and slaughter them right there on your farm and sell the meat to your neighbors, you can't. Most of that would be very illegal because zoning laws prohibit slaughterhouses on agricultural land. You have to get the cows slaughtered in some federally inspected facility, like a Tyson or ConAgra facility. As Salatin put it, every T-bone steak has to be wrapped in a $500,000 facility so that it can be sold to your neighbor. The fact that Salatin could do the slaughter on his own much more cleanly and responsibly and more humanely, more efficiently, more cheaply, and in a more environmentally friendly way, it doesn't matter. Instead, the farmers have to send his cows on a trip, which, by the way, is scary and stressful for the animals because they've never been off the farm before. And they get slaughtered in some slaughterhouse that's going to be much more stressful than whatever the farmer could do on his own farm. And the animals will be in some of the same spaces as animals from other farms. So if there's an issue with pathogens or something, this is a place where all the animals could potentially be contaminated because you have this central processing of animals. Every single T-bone steak has to be exported from our county and re-imported from our county to sell it to my next door neighbor. All this makes the meat more expensive for you, by the way. All this time and gas that the farmer has to waste to go drive to the slaughterhouse and retrieve his meat, or he's got to hire someone to do it. But also, after the farmer picks up his meat from the slaughterhouse, the county zoning ordinance says that this is now a manufactured product because it exited the farm and was re-imported as a value-added product, which throws a farm into a Walmart category, which is not allowed in agricultural areas. Now, there's sort of a workaround that Salatin and a lot of other farmers use, which allows them to sell their meat. And I'll tell you what that is later because the whole thing is just so ridiculous. And there's a Kafkaesque story attached to it. But first, let me talk about bacon. Bacon and cheese. So let's say you're raising pigs on your farm and you want to smoke and cure the meat to make bacon. Well, you got to do that in an inspected curing facility. But surprise, you can't have one of these facilities on your farm because processing facilities are illegal in an agriculturally zoned area. Okay, but let's say you decide to set aside some plot of land nearby that's technically not part of the farm, so not agriculturally zoned, so you can use it for industrial or commercial purposes. Well, you could do that, but there are all kinds of requirements. The curing facility needs bathrooms and an office. It needs impermeable walls and washable floors and so many lumens of light per square foot and handicapped access and temperature control. Now, if you just have a small volume of pork, it might not make sense to comply with all of this. Or if you're just starting out in your business, right? It's crazy to invest in all of this for a curing facility when you just want to sell to your neighbors or something. And by the way, all these requirements are not necessary to smoke or cure meat safely. People have been doing this for hundreds of years in shacks, and that's fine. It's not that hard to do. Okay, so let's say you've decided it's too expensive to comply with all these requirements to make your own curing facility. So another option is to take the meat to an inspected curing facility somewhere else. So now you've increased the number of trips that have to be performed just to make bacon. So you have to take the pigs to the slaughterhouse and then take them to an inspected curing facility. On top of that, there are regulations about how the meat is transported. It has to be in a refrigerated vehicle. So do you already see how these requirements might favor big corporate meat producers? Because if you just have a small volume of meat, you could probably keep your meat cold enough in some coolers with some ice packs. But no, the government says that doesn't matter. You still got to invest in a fancy refrigerated vehicle. For a larger producer, the cost of the vehicle will be spread out over the large volume of sales that they do. But for a small farmer, it may just not be worth it, even if you just want to sell a few pounds to your neighbors. It doesn't matter if you want to just sell 1 pound or a million, the infrastructure requirements are the same. You have a similar situation with making cheese. If you want to make cheese, you need a license and an inspected facility, but this would take tens of thousands of dollars, even if you just wanted to make a pound of cheese to sell it to your neighbor. He quotes something like $100,000 to just make 1 pound of cheese. Now you might be thinking, well, just make tens of thousands of pounds of cheese then. Then it's worth it to pay all that money for an inspected facility. Here's Salatin's response to that. Here's the answer, and it deals with the whole issue of innovation. All new things start small. Innovation demands a prototype first, and a prototype must be as small as possible. How do I know if I have a cheese that people will want unless I can experiment with a few pounds and try to sell some to folks? Anyway, going back to bacon. So Salatin wanted to be able to make bacon, but he decided that having his own facility was just too expensive for where he was at the time. So he looked into businesses that could cure his meat for him. And after many phone calls, he located a guy 100 miles away. Long story short, here's what it ends up costing Salatin to produce a pound of bacon, at least at the time of the writing of his book, which was from 2007. More than $1 goes to the slaughterhouse, then $2 to the curing facility and packaging. So that's $3 right there per pound. At the time, they sold the bacon for $6 a pound, so that means only $3 can go into the raising of the pig, like buying the feed and paying the labor to take care of the pigs, marketing, etc. That's not very much. Now, the regulations will look different for different farmers because different states or counties have their own regulations, but some of these are on the federal level, so all farmers in the US are affected. But by and large, the regulations almost always disadvantage the small operators because, again, the big operators have enough volume of meat that all these additional costs are spread over, because not all the costs are on a per volume basis. Not only that, the big food companies are powerful enough that they can lobby our politicians to change the regulations in their favor. So this actively suppresses competition coming from small farmers. They've rigged things in their favor using the government. This is why it costs more to buy bacon from a local farmer than the bacon at Walmart that comes from 1,000 miles away. Something is very wrong here. And it makes me particularly mad when it comes to bacon because I love bacon, but I don't end up buying a lot of it because the kind that I want, coming from farmers that raise their pigs humanely, that tends to be pretty expensive. And I'm not one of these people that needs everything to be pasture raised, but I'm more strict when it comes to pork because the way that a lot of factory farmers raise pork, it's just so inhumane. A lot of them use gestation crates for mother pigs, and they're basically cages where the pig can't even turn around. They do this so that they can't accidentally step on their piglets. But anyway, some of these poor pigs, they'll be caged like this for their entire lives. Very disturbing. So I don't want anything to do with that. When it comes to this issue, I'd really much rather buy it from a local farmer I know where I've seen for myself how the pigs are raised. That's really the only way you know for sure that the pigs were raised humanely. Anyway, these rules where farmers can't do their own slaughtering or their own processing of the meat, it just means we have this industrial food system where every part is disconnected from the rest. The farms are in one place, away from people, so they have no clue about any of the atrocities committed to get their food. It's out of sight, out of mind. And the industrial slaughterhouses are in another place, also not open to the public. Then there's the retail store, which must be located in some commercial district, surrounded by lots of pavement, plenty of parking, handicapped access, and whatever else is required for a retail area. And by the way, who likes this system? Who likes the kinds of spaces this leads to? The atrocious slaughterhouses that no one is allowed to see, the strip malls where you get your packaged foods. This is like the opposite of what you do if you wanted to increase transparency in business practices or foster community. So that brings me to another ridiculous thing, which is that there are all kinds of regulations about what the farmer can do on his own land. So for example, Salatin says that he would love to offer tours of his farm, like to school children or whatever, but they're a business, they're a for-profit entity. So realistically, they can't just do this for free because the person taking the time to lead the tours would have to be paid. So the only way this is going to work is to charge a little something for people who want to go on these tours. But it's illegal to charge even a small amount for tours because that would mean the farm is an education institution, and that is prohibited in agricultural zones. They're also not allowed to offer seminars either. Those are illegal. The zoning board views this as education as well. But Salatin argues that this is integral to the farm, as marketing even, because it's important to have an educated clientele. If you didn't preserve the consumer's awareness of what real agriculture is, maybe in the future consumers won't care about the air and the soil and water, or the differences in nutrition you get from pasture-raised meat versus factory-raised meat. Customers won't know what they're missing if they're unaware of how different meat is from Salatin's farm as compared with what you'd get on an industrial farm. And Salatin also wants to hold these seminars to help preserve the type of people who keep the support infrastructure of his type of farming alive, like independent chick hatcheries or dealers of farm equipment or local mills that can sell you feed that isn't genetically modified, etc. So these are all integral to the function of the farm itself, but technically it's illegal to hold these kinds of seminars. But the most relevant thing is that I think one should be able to do what one wants on one's own land, so long as you're not doing things to harm other people or making things dangerous for them, etc. Here's a quote from Salatin. America's strength has been the freedom to use property entrepreneurially. One of the distinguishing characters in the American culture was the sacred right to use property as an extension of personal dreams. Here's another ridiculous thing. So Salatin's farm has a small farm store. There are certain things he's allowed to sell there, and they get some foot traffic from people who come to buy things. There's an orchard nearby, and they make apple juice, and they don't get as much foot traffic on their orchard as Salatin's farm. So they would love to sell their apple juice at Salatin's farm store, but they're not allowed to because Salatin can only sell things that were produced on his own farm. If he wanted to sell things that weren't produced on his farm, he'd need a business license, and that would require all kinds of things like a building that was up to code and a parking area with handicap parking and public bathrooms, which, by the way, would be very expensive because you'd need a septic system and running water, and we're looking at thousands of dollars here. They would also need a commercial entrance, which would have meant that the dirt road that they were on would have to be widened to accommodate both entering and exiting traffic at the same time. Also gravel and grading on the road that's up to highway department standards, just to sell some apple juice. I mean, wouldn't it be nice if you were living in this neighborhood to be able to go to one place where all the neighborhood artisanal products could be found? Yarn from some place that raises sheep down the road, and soaps from your neighbor, and flowers from someone else. It'd be win-win for everyone, except for maybe Walmart, because you'd start to compete with them. Again, are you starting to see how giant corporations gobbled up more market share of everything while mom and pop shops struggled? All this zoning, it also encourages further disconnection in the community. It wasn't always this way. We used to have more areas where residential and farming and manufacturing and processing activities were connected and integrated and close to each other. If you go to historic Williamsburg, you'll see this. farmers close to carpentry places and barrel makers and craft workshops with artisans living right above the shops that they worked at. And then came zoning in the 1960s. Ironically, this came about at the very height of the civil rights movement when American culture appeared to be homogenizing and becoming less segregated. As that was happening, all these zoning laws segregated people and economic sectors. Salatin says that the result of all this segregation is that the farm has been relegated to colonial status because it's only allowed to sell raw commodities. It's not allowed to be in the business of value adding to those commodities, like turning pigs into bacon or pumpkins into pumpkin pie. So the government and the multinational corporations with which it colludes is an imperialist that essentially keeps small farmers as raw materials producers for the manufacturing machine. And in each case, the imperialist doesn't allow the producers to tap into the value added components. The producers are relegated to feudal serfdom in this industrial global complex. And farmers continue to be impoverished while rural wealth flows to the financial and trading centers. This is why, at least at the time of writing of this book, the average farmer is now 60 years old because serfdom doesn't attract the best and brightest. And of course, as the prices of raw commodities drop, especially since we get some of them from places like Asia or Africa really cheaply, right? Then the farmers are under pressure to just get bigger and cut more corners. This is why they want to confine the animals in horrible cramped conditions, or why fields get bigger, everything gets bigger, which also makes it difficult to manage waste products or diseases. Salatin also blames some of the farmers themselves because he says that there's this collective willingness on the part of the farmers to just be colonized, to be complicit peasants. And he says that farmers' organizations have just become lackeys for the empire builders. I see parallels here with what's happened with medicine, actually. We've had this huge shift where most doctors went from working for independent practices to working for corporate hospitals. We also now have these bureaucratic organizations that set guidelines or best practices, and the doctors just listen to them. During COVID, we saw how doctors were not always free to do as they saw fit, and they were getting pressures from government agencies or their own hospitals or licensing boards, etc. And some got fired for doing things a little differently. But the main result is just that the doctors are increasingly like cogs in a giant machine. And there are also parallels in how doctors tend to view the human body these days as well, largely as a result of their medical education, which is often highly influenced by the pharmaceutical industry. So too often they view the body as a set of disconnected parts instead of more holistically. And that's why we have this epidemic of chronic diseases and why most doctors are absolutely useless when it comes to curing these kinds of diseases. Because if you have psoriasis on your skin, instead of seeing the disease for what it is, which is a sign that there's something wrong on the inside, like maybe you're eating things that are causing this to happen, instead they send you to a dermatologist and they prescribe you a steroid cream, which just masks what's really wrong and won't heal it, often makes it worse in the long run. Anyway, where I was going with all of this is that this parallels with the totally fragmented, reductionist, compartmentalized mentality that dominates these bureaucracies, which have led to this fragmented landscape where people can be increasingly disconnected from where their things or food come from and from each other. Something Salatin brings up is that in the past, when someone moved into an area, he had to think about where the water came from, where his food came from, what he would do with trash or excrement, how to heat his home. In the modern era, it's not unusual for someone to not know any of these things. No knowledge of the natural checks and balances, economically and ecologically, that are required to sustain his house, water, energy, air, food, etc. Now, going back to what you could do on your own land. So Salatin at one point wanted to build a small 720 square foot house on their farm. This was going to be the house that he and his wife would retire to. The main house on the farm would go to his son, who would eventually need the bigger house once he had kids and all that. But they were told it was illegal to build any house that was that small, that was less than 900 square feet. When Salatin asked the regulators why this was the case, they were told because of resale value. But what business is it of theirs, the government, Who cares? Why is this the government's responsibility? Salatin wasn't planning to sell the farm anyway. They wanted to keep it in the family. Anyway, what he had originally wanted, which was a small A-frame house that had a composting toilet and would have taken maybe half a year to build, turned into a much more expensive 2-year project that had to be done with borrowed money because of all the government requirements. They couldn't make it a simple A-frame because the second floor needed to have a certain amount of headspace, and they couldn't use a composting toilet because the government deemed that that was not as efficacious as a septic system. So having to have a septic system meant that they could only build the house in certain locations. In case you don't know about septic systems, they require a leach field, and those can only be in certain locations. Anyway, they had a health department official come in and tell them where they could put their house. And what the official does is he uses a soil color guide to determine if a site is suitable. The soil color doesn't actually correspond that well to what's suitable. What matters are things like how well the soil drains, etc. But for some reason, they go by soil color. The official told them that the only suitable site was actually in a riparian zone. So this is a zone, any zones near streams or wetlands, things like that. Generally, you don't want sewage effluent near these because those can pollute the waterways. When Salatin brought this up, the official said that these areas are about the only places that will pass the soil color anymore. That's why all the residential estate developments are going along creeks. That's why all the residential developments are down in the fertile bottomlands, the best farmland in the country. So you're putting housing on an area that's most fertile and could be good farmland, and where the sewage effluent can pollute the waterways. In a separate part of the book, Salatin talks about all the dumb government programs to try to manage the problem of, you guessed it, pollution in our waterways. But this is a separate department of the government, so they might not even know that the health or housing people are telling everyone to put their houses near the streams. Anyway, it doesn't matter that the government bureaucrats are making this problem worse, the problem of polluted waterways, because they have unlimited taxpayer money to throw more money at the problem and hire additional sets of bureaucrats to throw more money into the problem of solving polluted waterways. And as it turns out, their solutions don't work anyway. We'll talk about that more later. Anyway, you can't make this stuff up. Now, I mentioned earlier that a farmer can raise cows, but they can't slaughter it on their farm, so they need to get it slaughtered someplace else. But that once they retrieve the beef parts, this is now considered a processed or manufactured product, and this can't be sold on the farm because it's an agriculturally zoned area. And I mentioned earlier that Salatin has some workarounds. So here's what he and a lot of farmers do. There's something called custom processing of beef, where you can bring in your own animal to be butchered, and then you take it home. This is fine so long as you're not planning to sell it to anyone. It specifically gets stamped as not for sale. Now, the workaround that Salatin and a lot of other farmers have used is that before one of his animals is slaughtered, his customers technically buy partial ownership of the animal. So, for example, a quarter of Betsy the cow is owned by Bob and another quarter is owned by Sally, etc. So now after the cow is slaughtered, he's not technically selling the parts to other people because they had already been sold off before the animal was slaughtered. So each cow he brings to the slaughterhouse has other people's names on it. This is a loophole that Salatin and many other farmers use to get around the regulations. Anyway, this was working just fine for a long time when some inspectors came and gave him the pink slip. They said that what he was doing wasn't legal because they thought Salatin was selling the beef after slaughter. But Salatin showed them that, in fact, each of these animals belonged to different people, and the inspectors went back and saw that each of the animals had names of the customers on them. Now here's how Salatin describes what happens next. Now they were in a pickle. They couldn't just admit that they had done this in error, so in order to save face, they changed their interpretation and asked me to write an affidavit that I wouldn't sell the meat after slaughter. Salatin was fine to do this, and that's what he did, but that wasn't the end of the story. They issued him a new interpretation. No matter what the agreement we had with the customer, and no matter if the name was on the animal before it was killed, if the money exchanged hands after the slaughter, it was automatically an after-slaughter sale, and therefore illegal. Now, this is just ridiculous. There are plenty of times when you've bought something and even though money hasn't been exchanged yet, it's considered sold. Like when you buy a house, often you sign a contract that commits to buying it. And at that point, the house is under contract, but money hasn't been exchanged yet. Here's another ridiculous thing. Many farmers have utilized this loophole and they were left alone. But for some reason, Salatin was singled out. And he was unlucky to get these overzealous inspectors that for whatever reason had an agenda and decided to reinterpret the rules. So this is Kafkaesque. The rules are ridiculous and arbitrary, but also can be reinterpreted at any time. And you can be singled out for no reason, even though you're doing what everyone else is doing. Now you might think, okay, why not just collect the money from the customer before the cow is killed? But part of the problem here is that you can't know the exact amount of edible meat you'll get from a cow just by weighing it while it's still alive. You can only know once you've processed it and gotten rid of the inedible parts like the guts and the hooves and etc. Anyway, long story short, they were able to work this out in the end, but it took some gymnastics. And basically, when they sell part of a cow before it's slaughtered, they collect some small amount of money upfront from the customer. Then once the cow is slaughtered, then they know the exact weight they'll ship to the customer, they adjust the price based on the actual weight, and they call that shipping and handling. It's ridiculous that this is what they have to do, but that's what they do. Here's another example of when things got Kafkaesque for Salatin. It has to do with chickens. When it comes to chickens, some producers are allowed to slaughter up to 20,000 of their own birds in their own facility. This is an exemption of the normal rules, and Salatin's farm has one. And for years, everything was fine with this, but one year, the head of the state's meat and poultry inspection changed, and that's when some major troubles began. Now, part of the reason he tells the story is to illustrate how Kafkaesque these situations with government bureaucrats can get, because the rules can just change on you if the bureaucrat assigned to you changes or they're in a bad mood that day or whatever. A lot of these rules are not even codified in a super explicit way, but are very open to interpretation. So to go back to what happened to Salatin, he had been taking advantage of this exemption, which allowed him to slaughter up to 20,000 of his chickens right there on his farm. There are no exemptions when it comes to pigs or cows or other animals, by the way. Anyway, he has this outdoor space where he does this, and actually, you can see a video of it online. This is much nicer than your typical slaughtering facility on so many levels. If you had walls, it would be a dark and dingy place with damp corners that can harbor pathogens, which would have to get sanitized by toxic cleaners. And it's also just a much more pleasant place to work in than a dark place that would have to be lit with artificial lights. And you're surrounded by fresh air. You can hear the birds singing. Also, having no walls allows breezes to come through so it stays more cool. And also, customers sometimes want to see how the processing gets done. If you, as a customer, care about things like humane slaughtering or whatever, this is how you can see your meal being killed. It's ultimate transparency. Anyway, even though this open facility was fine with the previous inspector, suddenly the new guy coming in says that this facility is not okay. He said it wasn't in compliance. He said to Salatin, "An open-air facility is inherently unsanitary." Salatin responded, "So you never go on picnics? People have been processing meat and poultry in the open air for centuries. What's the big deal all of a sudden?" The inspector said, "That's just the way I see it, and if one fly comes in and lands on one chicken, that is now an adulterated product." Salatin responded, "You mean if a fly lands on your hot dog at a picnic, you throw it away?" The inspector also said that Salatin was not in compliance because there were no bathrooms in the facility for your employees, and also because he didn't have a changing room with 12 lockers. Never mind that at the time, Salatin didn't have employees, and even if he did, there were 4 bathrooms within 50 feet, 2 at his house and 2 at his mom's house. Anyway, long story short, Salatin got together with his lawyer and the chicken police, and they met with federal regulators to litigate this out. I guess the federal guys got involved because maybe what they say takes precedence over what the state regulators say. I don't know. I honestly don't fully understand it. Anyway, one of the things Salatin presented at these meetings were some results that some college students had found for a lab project. So for this lab project, they had made some measurements of total bacteria counts on the chickens from Salatin's farm and compared them to the numbers on supermarket birds. And long story short, the birds from Salatin's farm had a lot less bacteria. So Salatin presented this to the chicken police, and they said something like, "Well, pathogens aren't the only things we're concerned about. We're concerned about the water quality, the temperature in the chill tanks, ambient temperature in the bagging room." By the way, you'd think that the regulators, the chicken police, would be curious about how or why Salatin's slaughter chickens had so much less bacteria than the chickens in the supermarket, but no, they weren't curious. Long story short, the federal guys actually agreed with Salatin, so he won the battle. But it was at the expense of countless days and nights worrying about it and strategizing about it. There were many late night conversations he was having with his wife when they could have been getting sleep or reading to their children. And be assured that there are many farmers out there that didn't fight the bureaucrats and got shut down. Those bureaucrats are still wasting taxpayer money, going after farmers for things that don't matter. But this also just illustrates how the fate of your small farm or business is a matter of luck to a large degree. And the bureaucrats will go way beyond what's created in laws by Congress. The bureaucrats themselves will make up rules. On top of that, a lot of the regulations are so vaguely worded that they can be interpreted completely differently by different inspectors. You may think you're complying, but any day an inspector can come and disagree and shut down your business. All it takes is an inspector that's just in a bad mood or has an axe to grind. I mean, listen to some of the regulations here for the farmers that get the poultry exemption in Illinois. So, facilities and sanitation, acceptable or unacceptable. So this is incredibly vague. Do you see how this gives incredible latitude to the field agent to demand any infrastructure that they deem necessary. Or here's another: dressing/eviscerations, acceptable or unacceptable. So evisceration is the process of removing the organs, and whole books have been written about how to eviscerate chickens. There are many ways to do it. So what's acceptable or not, it's totally open to interpretation. A lot of the regulations are also just meant with super large facilities in mind, and they're just pointless or harmful for a small operation. Like, is bleeding, picking, evisceration done in a separate area? Yes or no? What's even meant by separate? Or what's an area? For a small operation, you don't need a separate room or something. On Salatin's farm, it's just a few feet away. Is that considered separate? Can it just be a different table? Here's another one: packaging area, acceptable, unacceptable. What if you don't need a packaging area? What if your packaging area is a lawn chair with some plastic bags on it? In Salatin's case, most of his birds aren't packaged at all because the neighbors come in on the day of processing and pick their birds fresh out of the chill vats. This question just assumes you have some huge business where you'd even need a separate packaging area. Inedible product handling, acceptable, unacceptable. Here they're talking about the inedible parts of the chickens and how they get handled. So what does acceptable product handling mean? Containers or something? Method of disposal: burial, rendering, sanitary service, pickup, other. Again, here they're talking about the inedible parts of the chicken and what you do with them. They don't even offer the best choice, which is composting. According to Salatin, this is the best way to dispose of the parts of the chicken that won't get used, but apparently it's illegal without a permit, at least in the state that he's in, which is Virginia, even though it is legal to compost beef guts, so long as they're transported in a crash-proof container. But sheep guts you can dump along the road. But chicken guts, that's a different story. They can only be composted at licensed facilities. Here's another story that illustrates how stupid some of these regulations are. There was a time when USDA inspectors came to look at Salatin's eggs, and the way they did it was that they brought some super bright lights and looked over 100 eggs. To be legal for sale, only one egg in 100 may have what's called adhering dirt. That means anything that can be physically scraped off, like it could be a piece of straw or a feather or egg yolk from a broken egg, manure, anything. The way Salatin describes how these two inspectors came to inspect 100 eggs is as a comedy routine. The way they scrutinized each egg so seriously, trying to decide if what they saw on an egg was a bump or a calcium deposit or a piece of dirt or just a natural spot on the shell. At Salatin's farm, by the way, their eggs have a bit more genetic diversity than commercial eggs, so they just naturally have more spots, and some will have darker shells or lighter shells or little ridges or calcium deposits. Anyway, the inspector spent a couple of hours looking at 100 eggs, and in the end, they determined that 2 of them had adhering dirt, and therefore their entire batch of eggs was illegal to sell. Just to let you know, by the way, Salatin doesn't like to wash their eggs if they're clean. When hens lay eggs, they naturally coat it with a thin film that acts as a bacterial protection and also reduces the evaporation from the shell, which is a bit porous to the environment. So if you wash the egg, you wash off some of this protective film. Anyway, after all of Salatin's eggs were deemed illegal to sell, the inspectors said to just clean them and be ready for a re-exam in a couple of days. So Salatin and his crew went through all their eggs and removed every fleck of straw or tiny speck of dirt. 2 days later, the inspectors came back and looked at the eggs with a cursory glance. And this time they didn't bring the bright lights or anything. They just glanced at them and said, they're okay. Suddenly the eggs were legal to sell. So a couple of things to say here. Nothing about the actual check they did, where they looked for adhering dirt, nothing about that actually checked for anything that could hurt people. It was just a cosmetic check, not a safety check. Now, candling is a process which can actually show interior deterioration of an egg. This is where you shine an intense light through the egg in a dark room, and this allows you to sort of see inside the egg to see how big the air space is in there and other things. It'll tell you if there's some deterioration inside, which will indicate that it's old, but even an old egg isn't likely to hurt you. It won't taste very good, but it won't hurt you. Anyway, the inspectors weren't even doing that. They were just looking on the outside. People put a lot of credence into grading systems, but nothing about anything that these inspectors were doing actually checked for something that could hurt you. The inspectors only dealt with observable qualities like spots on the outside of the eggs. Salatin says that this is typical of the inspection system. It checks for the least important things and doesn't check for the most important things. Then the fact that the inspectors barely looked at the eggs the second time they came around, I mean, this just shows you that none of this is about safety. This is all just completely based on whim and checking off boxes. The whole safety net is a smokescreen. In the end, the best bet you have is to get products from people you trust, or at least are incentivized to make their customers happy. The individual farmer that you buy from, who's an entrepreneur and who can't necessarily afford a fancy lawyer to defend himself if he has disgruntled customers, he has a vested interest in selling you things that aren't going to make you sick. His reputation is at stake if you screw something up. It's also just worse to centralize things if you're worried about contamination or bioterrorism, and you're better off with lots of smaller facilities as opposed to one centralized facility. These regulators, they create their own little world, but they will drag the small businesses or farmers in with them. And the small farmers will have no choice but to go along with these ridiculous arbitrary things that are totally divorced from anything that actually matters. It just exists to create busy work for the inspectors or give them a power trip. And we're paying taxpayer money on this. I'd rather pay less taxes and inspect any eggs I'm going to buy myself. By the way, some of the themes here, it reminded me of what we saw in the world of public health, because during all the COVID insanity, everyone was told to get the vaccine, even if you were naturally immune because you'd had COVID and recovered, even if you could show that your antibody levels were good, etc. I mean, antibody levels aren't even the perfect correlate for immunity against something anyway, because you could be immune without having the relevant antibodies, but it's just that it's measurable. So that's why people focus on that. I don't want to get into all that. If you want to know more, you can look at my Substack where I talk about this. But the main point is that public health was requiring things that made no sense. And speaking of things that made no sense, here's another example of this. And this will just make you mad because not only is our taxpayer money being used to either do useless things or things that actively harm small farmers or businesses, but they will often do things that make the situation worse. So basically, the government started a program to deal with all the tons and tons of manure from animal farms. Now, manure can be a blessing or a curse. It can obviously be a blessing because when you apply the right amount to the soil, it'll add in nutrients and make the soil richer over time as it gets processed by the organisms there, the microbes. But in the winter, most of this biological activity in the soil stops, so the manure just stays there unprocessed, it doesn't get absorbed. And when there's rain or snow melt, a lot of it will just run off and end up polluting the waterways. Anyway, the government funded this local program that created lagoons that are supposed to hold the manure. And in the winter, this is supposed to hold the manure long enough until the winter's over, and then you could spread it around. This was supposed to make it so less manure would end up in the Chesapeake Bay. Anyway, this system was developed by environmentalist researchers at Virginia Tech University, and it cost a lot of money and became the official protocol for best management practices. Well, here's how well that worked out. Salatin once spoke to a local soil conservation service official, and here's what he said. "If you ever tell anyone I said this, I will deny it outright. But I will tell you that we have put far more manure into the Chesapeake Bay since this program began than we did before. What's happened is that now the farmers can store their manure for 6 months. In the summer, they're busy with fieldwork and other chores. They wait and spread it when they aren't busy. And guess when that is? In the winter, preferably on frozen ground, and often in the snow. Frozen ground doesn't let any of the manure penetrate anywhere. When the next rain or snow melt occurs, every bit of it goes into the bay." I mean, this illustrates how things that were centrally planned by bureaucrats, even when teamed up with academics, will often just not work out and come with unintended consequences. It gets worse. So Salatin asked this official why he couldn't use his clout as an administrator of the program to change this. The official replied, "You don't understand. The environmentalists won a huge victory with this program. How do you think they would look if they had to admit they caused more harm than good? And do you really think I can take on the entire scientific community of Virginia Tech? I'd be laughed out of town. And the politicians that passed the legislation, do you really think they'll admit they made a mistake? They would look like fools for their constituents. Once a program starts, no matter whether it's working out or not, the inertia to keep it going is stronger than anything else." So where have we seen this before? I mean, have you ever noticed all kinds of government programs that aren't working? They just keep continuing. Here's what Salatin says about these government programs. They don't solve problems. They just perpetuate a perception that something is being done. Meanwhile, Americans keep paying more taxes and wondering why all these new problems keep spouting up. Now, Salatin has figured out what to do with his manure during the winter, and he actually takes advantage of it. I won't go into all the details, but he actually combines it with wood chips and straw and things like that to create a bedding that naturally ferments over time to create heat. And this is what the cows actually stand on during the winter, and has a bonus that it helps warm the cows over the winter. What's also nice is that the wood chips are essentially waste products where he lives because they come from dead or dying trees that need to be brought down anyway. People think that cutting trees is always bad, but in fact, he says that it's essential to maintaining healthy forests, and we're not doing enough of that these days. And that's because the dead or dying trees are non-productive. They're not photosynthesizing the way a healthy tree would. So getting rid of them opens up space for healthier things. Plus, you need to cull here and there to suppress fires, etc. Anyway, the point is that Salatin has a low-tech solution that utilizes waste or cheap material and solves the problem of what to do about manure during the winter. But what got favored was a really expensive solution, which was creating these artificial lagoons with concrete and etc. By the way, it also turns out that the manure is so acidic that it creates cracks in the concrete of the lagoons. So eventually the sludge oozes out. And because it's so acidic, it kills earthworms on contact. If you tried to spread the slurry, the ooze in the rain, the following morning, you'd see millions of dead worms lying on top of the ground where they had tried to escape the burning. Each lagoon cost something like $50,000 to make, by the way. Again, so many parallels with COVID. Instead of promoting simple solutions to increase health that would make you less susceptible to COVID, or simple or cheap interventions like vitamin D, we got high-tech solutions that were very expensive, novel, and patented. Salatin gave many other examples of this in his book, where solutions featured expensive, high-tech interventions over things that solved the problem better and were simple and more holistic. And the government or their collaborators, the academics at universities, could come up with poorly designed studies to justify their interventions. An example was how they handled an issue that has to do with the senescence of grass. So senescence is when an organism doesn't die, but it's in a lower metabolic state. It's not growing anymore. When grass reaches senescence, it becomes less palatable to the cows and less nutrient dense, and the cows don't want to eat it. Now, on Salatin's farm, they have a controlled grazing program where the cows are moved around a certain way, so this isn't an issue. But Virginia Tech scientists, they came up with a high-tech solution, an herbicide that slows the senescence of grass. And in their studies, they compared the herbicide with conventionally grazed pastures, where the cows aren't being moved around the way Salatin's cows are. And the scientists' charts showed that, hey, the herbicide paid for itself in increased grazing from the cows and therefore increased meat production from the cows per acre. But Salatin asked them, did you compare the herbicide-treated regimen with a controlled grazing program, like what Salatin does? And they did not. That's because controlled grazing companies don't exist, but chemical companies do. And they dump tons of money on the scientific community to run these tests for them so they could justify their products. Again, we see parallels of this all the time in the medical pharma complex, don't we? The researchers are hired to compare these expensive interventions against nothing instead of cheap or generic interventions that already work. Not only that, it's also common that the kinds of interventions that are high tech, like some herbicide or something, they'll get tax breaks. I mean, farmers will get tax breaks to use those solutions, but they won't get a tax break if they've figured out a more natural way to solve the problem, like the way Salatin has. And speaking of tax deductions, they often have a way of favoring corporations also. Like there are all kinds of tax benefits that corporations can utilize, but for a small producer who has an integrated business and home life, the tax code doesn't allow for similar deductions. So for example, if a corporation hires a 24-hour security force for their farm, all the expenses associated with that would be a business expense. But on a small farm, the security is the farmer himself and his family. They're just living there. They are the security, but their living expenses are not counted as business expenses. There are many other examples of things like this. Here's another thing that's stupid. So all the labor laws that prohibit teenagers from working, or in some cases, the teens can work, but they're not allowed to use any power tools or anything with a motor. It's ridiculous that 16-year-olds can drive at 70 miles an hour on the freeway, but they can't operate a lawnmower. Or they're old enough to be instructed in the uses of a condom in schools, but they can't operate a cordless screwdriver. So here's a list of some things that Salatin says would be useful to do on the farm, but are illegal for a teenager to do. Mow the lawn, kill chickens, split wood, drive a tractor, build things using a cordless screwdriver and circle saw, prune trees using a handsaw, operate a generator, operate a water pump, drill a hole in a board. The list goes on. The types of jobs that young, inexperienced people would have done in the past are now often done by illegal migrants. And I don't think this is a good thing. I mean, it changes the social structure of a neighborhood. Salatin would rather use apprentices that want to work and learn while they work than to use illegal aliens. That seems like the more socially responsible thing to do for the community. Here's how Salatin puts it. We've taken away the dignity of early adulthood and replaced it with foolishness and recreation. Meanwhile, the farmers in the community are denied the benefits of all this untapped youthful zest. Here's another quote. We are raising a self-absorbed generation precisely because they have been denied the necessary education and human activity, namely, serving others through our abilities and appreciating all members of the team. By the way, I made a video about how modern society extends childhood. I'll link to it below. In it, I also talk about how in the past, people were accomplishing big things at very young ages, whereas nowadays, people at those ages are kept stunted because they have to be in school or they think they need to go to universities, etc. We're wasting our youth. But the bigger point is that a willing worker and a willing employee should be able to come to an agreement without government intervention. Now, I've already given examples of how government regulations often help the big corporate entities and hurt the little guys. Like how the rules will require investing a lot of money into a facility to comply. And if you're a larger producer, the cost of this gets spread out over large volumes of sales. But if you're just starting out, this is prohibitively expensive. Or if you need to pay for software or lawyers or whatever to comply with complicated regulations. Again, this cost is spread out over a large volume of sales, but is a very large proportion of what you earn as a small farmer. Or how certain things are tax deductible, like hiring security for your facility, but for a small farmer, the security is just him and his family living there on the farm, and his living expenses there aren't tax deductible. Or as I discussed in the Kafka section of this video, if you get an overzealous inspector and you're a small farm, good luck. That person could potentially shut your entire business down. But the large companies can afford to hire attorneys and have them on retainer. And of course, the biggest companies can afford to lobby the government to rig the rules in their favor. And that's what they do. In fact, there's a lot of evidence that prohibition, when alcohol was outlawed in America for about a decade, there's a lot of evidence that suggests that that was actually financed by petroleum interests at the time. They wanted to shut down the healthy, decentralized alcohol industry. At that time, before Prohibition, lots of farmers were making alcohol, and it used to be so common that the Model T Ford could easily switch between running on gasoline or alcohol, because so many farmers and communities had their own alcohol fueling systems. But Prohibition put the government in charge of alcohol, and that decentralized fuel infrastructure just completely vanished. Getting back to how regulations harm smaller companies, here's another story that illustrates this. So Salatin tells a story of how he wanted to sell some of his chickens in a different state. He's in Virginia, and he wanted to try selling some at a market in DC. But in order to do that, to sell them across state lines, you have to get them slaughtered at a federally inspected facility. Now, they had a horrible experience with this because, long story short, they would locate a federally inspected slaughterhouse, and it would be hundreds of miles away. The chickens traveled 200 miles live and 300 miles dead just to be sold at a market that was 150 miles from where they were raised. But also, they kept having this problem where the slaughterhouse they were going to would shut down. Go out of business. And it turns out that this tends to happen at the smaller slaughterhouses because the inspectors did not like going to them because they didn't have the recreation rooms for the inspectors the way the bigger plants did. And the prestige wasn't as great as being in charge of big operations. So often the inspectors actually wanted to put these smaller places out of business. I'll give one more example of regulations hurting small farmers. So Salatin can sell his chickens to a restaurant. And remember, his chickens are considered uninspected. Remember how previously I talked about how they're allowed to slaughter and sell up to 20,000 chickens of their own where they don't need to have it inspected, etc. But there's a rule that if a restaurant buys any poultry from an uninspected source, those chickens can't be stored with ones that were from an inspected source. What this means is if you're too small of a producer to supply all the chickens that a restaurant needs, that means the restaurant has to get some chickens from you and some from another source, and now they have to worry about not mixing your uninspected birds with inspected ones. So if they just don't want to deal with that, they may just go with a larger supplier, even if it's 1,000 miles away. By the way, what a dumb rule. Like, if a chicken's safe, it's safe. Who cares if they're mixed with other inspected or uninspected chickens in the fridge? These regulations have gotten out of control. Page 203 from the book. To justify their existence, the government agents cannot be content to solve the initial problem. They continue to push and push beyond the point of reason until the original agenda becomes mired in absurdity. Page 282. The additional regulations destroy the decentralized portion of the food system because only the centralized elements can handle the overhead to fill out more paperwork. Page 61. What these regulations do is ensure that whatever money is made in tomorrow's food system will be made by today's players. Upstarts are not allowed. Page 269. Teddy Roosevelt used to say that nothing in government happens by accident. There is always an agenda. And especially today, the agenda usually involves more power and money to large corporate and bureaucratic interests, with a parallel disempowering and impoverishing of smaller public and private entities. Salatin says that most farmers who have tried what they have and run into these regulatory obstacles quietly go out of business. Very few farmers have the will or savvy to go up against these government agents. Salatin says that he has watched many farmers simply quit. So there's a system that large players in the food industry have been pushing for. It's called the National Animal Identification System, or NAIS. So this is a proposal to put microchips in every farm animal, every cow, pig, chicken, horse, sheep, or goat. Originally, they were going to do fish too, the fish. And this was a way to register these animals with the USDA. According to government officials, this enables them to find you in case a disease outbreak occurs. The goal, ostensibly, is to protect farmers from an outbreak. They also claim that if any animal is sick with some disease, then they can trace back the history of the animal to see what other animals ever came into contact with it. So as you can imagine, this would be a very costly endeavor. It's already mandatory in some states. Millions and millions of dollars have already been spent on this. Here's what Salatin says about this. If at this point you were thinking totalitarianism, you are right. Plenty of conspiracy theorists see this system as a prototype for tracking people. Just to put this into perspective, realize that for the first time in human history, this will require a license or registration from the government in order for one person to have one chicken for a breakfast egg for their own table, assuming that chicken was purchased from someone. That is a policy with far-reaching consequences. 2 countries have already implemented this program, but only for cattle, at least at the time of the making of this book. That's Australia and Canada. Australia's 4-year record on this is dismal. The equipment that reads the chips, they have a very high error rate. And in Canada, the track record, again, only on cattle, is equally abysmal. So the microchips are on ear tags, and the farmers say, quote, "These tags fall out and we just stick another one in, but nobody checks and nobody knows anything." The truth is that this is a clever public relations campaign to create the semblance of protection for an ignorant public. As Salatin puts it, for crying out loud, how can a government that can't even keep up with a few million illegal aliens possibly keep up with billions of cows, chickens, turkeys, pigs, horses, sheep, and goats? Salatin spoke with an attorney who represents one of the largest food businesses in the world when the subject of this National Animal Identification System, NAIS, came up. He said he would put it to me straight. And this is what that attorney said. People don't trust the large corporations. If you're a large corporation, you need that trust to survive. How do you get that trust? You create a system that makes it look like you care. People want to see you doing something that protects them. That is how the NAIS program came to be. But, and here's the other part of the equation, if you are the chief executive of a large business, you don't want to pay for it. Instead, you wine and dine politicians to convince them that they will curry favor with their constituents if they demand this program. Now you have people's faith without having to pay for it. In other words, the taxpayers pay for it because it's a government program. Now, this book was published in 2007, and this national identification system, as far as I know, was technically terminated because of pushback from farmers and other people, but a new thing, which is very similar, has started up in its stead. This is the USDA's Animal Disease Traceability Framework. And as far as I know, the USDA is still broadly for this. And again, it's not mandatory, but it seems some states have implemented their own versions of this that are mandatory, and it's often incentivized by USDA grants. The main point is that the threat of this hasn't gone away, and industry forces are still going to be pushing for this. What's ironic is that if you really cared about safety and disease outbreaks, you wouldn't promote centralized facilities like centralized slaughterhouses or factory farms. You would do everything you could to decentralize the food system instead. But this doesn't get pushed by the lawmakers or bureaucrats because this doesn't serve big ag. And by the way, anytime there has been an outbreak of disease, like the tiniest bit of avian influenza, the only solution has been to just kill everything. So if one bird tested positive in a house of 10,000, the whole house of birds would get killed. Recently, there was a story of a bunch of ostriches that got killed. This was in Canada. Because some birds from the ostrich farm were supposedly sick, the government decided to kill them all. The sane thing would have been to let the survivors of the disease live, because they would be immune to the disease, but no, they did not want to do that. And it probably won't surprise you to learn that the main thing that governments promote to increase immunity in animals is vaccination. That's because the people who take the regulators or lawmakers out to lunch are the vaccination needle people. Salatin has said that one of the overriding goals in writing his book was to impress upon Americans how much government agents often have an agenda that's driven by interests that aren't about seeking the truth. For example, he once talked to a federal inspector at a slaughterhouse and asked him why inspectors need to even be inspecting the animals at the slaughterhouse. Like, why not just test the pieces of chicken that are going to be sold? For example, the FDA has set a threshold for how much rat manure can be in granola. So why can't the Food Safety and Inspection Service just set a threshold for, parts per million of salmonella or whatever? When Salatin asked this, the inspector agreed that this would be fine, but then I'd be out of a job. That's what he said. One of the things Salatin says a number of times is how he's constantly surprised at how people might be skeptical of one part of the government, like the Pentagon. They'll recognize that it's a war machine, but somehow they'll believe another part of the government, like the EPA or the USDA. Every one of these departments has an agenda, and the bureaucrats are not interested in the truth. They are political creatures wanting to expand their power, position, and possessions. People don't become divine or righteous just because they receive a government check and have alphabet soup credentials behind their name. So here's what Salatin says we should do. He says that the problem with the leaders of the clean food movement is that they are still, by and large, liberal and all about using the government to try to fix things. But the government is horrible at fixing things, and they often just make things worse. And they're a centralizing power that makes it easier for the big players, the big corporations, to get ahead and stomp out competition from the little guys. Instead, Salatin favors a more libertarian approach. He says he wishes we could have a Food Security Act, which would offer freedom of choice to every citizen to decide what to eat. People would sign an I am responsible for my food waiver that would give them the right to opt out of government sanctioned food, and they would take responsibility for the food themselves. In return, anything such citizens wanted to buy would be legal to sell, and the farmers could sell whatever they wanted to them. It would be a parallel food system. And I'm sure that in this food system, new solutions to the problems of safety would probably arise, like private companies that would check for things like contamination or nutrient content, etc., because these are things that people would care about. I've talked about this in the past, like how there are probably all kinds of solutions like this that never got off the ground because the government essentially has a monopoly on it, or people just assume the government's got it covered. Anyway, as the two parallel systems develop track records, we can compare that decentralized model with the government regulated food system. And that's how we'll know whether it works. But we won't know until we try. Salatin says that liberals are always saying that the free market is responsible for corporate abuse and things like that. But this isn't true because we actually haven't had a free market for a very long time. Things have actually been rigged in the favor of these corporations for a long time. And that's why we've just had more and more consolidation in so many industries. So yeah, this is what he wants. He just wants for people to have the option to opt out. It's just a freedom to choose what to eat without the government getting involved. The only reason the founding fathers didn't grant this freedom, by the way, to choose our own food was because it was so basic, such a fundamental personal right that they couldn't have conceived that special protection would be needed. But right now we need it because that's just how far toward tyranny we've moved. On page 342, he says, if I don't have the right to choose what I feed my 3 trillion bacteria in my intestines, then what other right could possibly be more important? This is such a fundamental notion that to even say it seems silly. And yet, here in America, many people do not believe such choices should exist. I said in the beginning of this video that this book was about so much more than just what's going on in farming or agriculture. It's about something much bigger. It's about how a lot of options were closed off to us because things like government regulations and the way that industry and the government colludes, these things rig things against the little guys, and they kill things before they can even get started. And I don't think we've even begun to realize what we've missed or what could have been because of this. Like, just imagine if some grandma in your neighborhood who had a knack for cooking and decorating, just imagine if it weren't illegal for someone like her to turn her shed into a part-time restaurant in the neighborhood. And, you could make sheds very nice these days. You could deck it all out. Anyway, you can imagine that this little part-time restaurant from this otherwise retired granny could become a meeting spot for people all over the neighborhood, and people would get to know each other that way. And now imagine that there were lots of little things like this all over the place. People could turn little parts of their houses into a small business. Maybe one person sells soaps part-time and another repairs electronics out of his garage or whatever. But all of this requires permitting or licensing, or some of it's illegal depending on where you live because of zoning requirements or whatever. Even if some of this is doable, a big part of the reason it doesn't happen is because there are all these hurdles to doing them. It's why you don't see a lot of little stores or restaurants mixed in with housing in suburbs, for example. And I think this is unfortunate because it would make suburbs a lot more interesting. And a lot of these casual little part-time businesses, they would turn into full-time businesses because maybe they realize, hey, this little part-time thing is really popular. I think I could quit my corporate job. You can imagine how different that would be than the world we're in now. People complain about how there aren't enough good jobs, or that the jobs that are available are at big corporations. And by and large, a lot of people don't like corporate culture and don't want to be a cog in this giant corporate machine. I don't like these things either, but people blame capitalism or the free market for the state of affairs, as if we live in a free market. I think the saddest thing about the kinds of things discussed in Salatin's book is that we don't know what we're missing. People just think this is the way it has to be, where so many industries are consolidated or completely dominated by multinational corporations, where so many of the main places that people meet each other are at strip malls. So that was one thought I had from reading this book. There were two other thoughts that I've been having for a while that finally got connected thanks to this book. One of them came up because it's the holiday season, and in the past, when I had to get a gift for an adult, in theory, I thought that giving to some charity on their behalf was a good idea because, often adults, they already have most of the things they need, and it can be hard to know what to get them, but who could hate giving to a good cause, right? But I now think it's actually quite difficult to do charitable giving well. What I mean is that you can give your money to a charity or an organization that claims to be doing something about some cause you care about, but you really don't know what's going on in these organizations. And quite frankly, there are a lot of scams out there, as we've learned. And I'm not saying that there aren't effective charities out there, but honestly, I'm skeptical of a lot of them. And I think over time, a lot of them become about perpetuating their own jobs, kind of like what happens in government agencies. Or they can get co-opted by forces that have agendas that you're not for. So it can be difficult to know how to actually give money well to nonprofits that will use that money effectively. They might say on their website that they've accomplished this or that, but unless you have a close relationship with someone in the organization, or you can go see some of the results for yourself, you really don't know. So this problem actually connected with a different problem I've always had, which is that every time I go to the farmer's market, I'm always sort of hemming and hawing a bit about getting things. And I'm usually thinking, well, I could get that beef a bit cheaper at the supermarket. Do I really want to pay that price right now? It's like $2 more expensive than at the supermarket. These are the kinds of thoughts that I have. But the thought came to me recently that supporting small farms that grow animals in a humane way that's in harmony with the environment, they actually do a lot of the things that I care about that I would normally donate to a charity for example. In other words, I could give to nonprofits that are supposedly about taking care of the environment or about animal welfare and all these things, but I can't really see whether what they're doing is effective and what my money is going towards. But most small farms are transparent about what happens on their farms. You can go see the animals, at least insofar as regulations allow. And usually you can meet the farmers. You can talk to people in their community to learn whether they've been good neighbors. So what I decided, and this is just for me personally, is that the money that might have gone towards charitable giving, and by the way, this is not a ton of money, I'm not rich or anything, but the money that might have been set aside for charitable giving is going to go towards supporting small farmers more. And the bonus is that you get better quality food anyway. That's sort of the way I'm thinking about it these days, because for me, small farms that grow food in a way that's environmentally sound, they check a lot of boxes when it comes to the things I care about. Plus, they help maintain strong rural economies, and keeping those little guys alive as competition against the giant corporations. They're the only things left that's standing in the way of the goddamn corporations taking over everything. And this goes for other items that you might need to buy too, whether it's house stuff or clothing or whatever. By the way, I hate how when you go to different cities in the world and certain brands are everywhere in every mall and in all the gentrified neighborhoods. And it's not that all these brands are bad, but we've just had too much consolidation lately, too much standardization and globalization. And this connects with another thing in this book, which is that we have this tendency to offload things to organizations too much or institutions. But maybe what we need to do instead is to have more agency and personal responsibility. So instead of throwing money at a nonprofit that purports to take care of the causes you care about, maybe there's something you could do yourself that helps. I don't necessarily mean start a nonprofit, but for example, suppose you care about educating less fortunate kids. Well, maybe there's a less fortunate kid that you could just help directly. Maybe you can mentor that person. Or if you just don't have the time, but you have money, you could literally hire the best teacher you know for that kid. Just as an example. I don't know. I'm just coming up with random things, but you get what I mean. My main point is that you probably have more agency than you think. And at least for a lot of causes, you might be able to take matters into your own hands more than you think, where you could see the outcome of your actions instead of just throwing money at an organization or institution that's essentially a black box. And this is very much related to what Salatin says in his book over and over again, how we need to get over this mentality that the government should take care of things for us or protect us. We should figure out our solutions instead. And if you want a better world, you can start with the people around you. I'll end this video with an English proverb that Salatin also quotes in his book. The happiness of every country depends on the character of its people rather than the form of its government. Thanks for watching.